We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
G'day and welcome to another episode of the Mankind Podcast. I'm your host today, Brandon Clift, and today we are diving into the King archetype. If you've been joining us for the series, we started with Doug Gillette in the Lover. We moved to the Warrior. Our last episode was the Magician, and now we're at the King. You know, the King energy is something that's very important and precious to me. My animal name that I gained through the Mankind Project is King Chimp. And the reason why I sought that spiritual guide is because of the power of the King energy. You know, when I am engaged in my King in its fullness, I'm centered, I'm decisive, I live with integrity, I protect my energy, I create clean boundaries and clean and clear agreements with those around me, in turn respecting myself, and by doing so, others around me can respect me. And I'm also to provide order for me, order for those around me, and not just order people around, but make clear of what success looks like for me in my life. Now, all throughout history, we've known of kings and kind of societally, kings have always been placed in the center. So it's only natural that when we are engaging in the King in its fullness, we can find ourselves feeling very centered, very grounded, almost a rock in crisis. Someone that can see clarity and see an event or a situation or something basically for what it is and not what story is being built up about the situation. The calm in the storm, you could say. However, the shadow side of the King for me, you know, the weakling or the tyrant, I personally fall into the weakling more often than not. It looks like not getting my way or kind of falling into that victim space. So the King energy, for me, I think is one of the most powerful and unfortunately one of the most relevant today in what we're seeing in the world. As the time of the release of this podcast, Putin is in the middle of his siege and invasion of Ukraine. And as Doug will explain in this episode, you know, Putin is sadly, but also undeniably a perfect representation of King and Shadow. So if you're looking for some real life tangible examples of what Shadow King looks like and what it's capable of, well, there you have it. All you have to do is turn on the TV and you'll see. However, a King in its fullness is inspiring and inspires others. And we need to tap back into that King energy in its fullness. Too often are we being led, more often than not, by men who do not have access to this fullness of the King and instead are just behaving in such shadowy ways. And yet they're who we elect to higher office. They're who we put in charge of our companies. So my call to action for all of you as you've listened to this series is find ways to find your groundedness, to find center, to find access mundi. How can you get clean with these energies of all these archetypes? And today I can promise you're going to find out some insights and some tools as Doug and I discuss the King in all of its beauty and all of its tragedy and how you yourself can use that energy to your advantage. So I hope you've enjoyed this series. This is the last one as far as each of the 4 archetypes. And then next week, we'll go into a conversation with Doug and my fellow co-hosts, Paul and Boyson, if they can all make it, to talk about Access Mundi, how to find center. But for now, I hope you're excited for this incredible, very fun, and very transcendent interview, you could say, on the King archetype. Enjoy. G'day and welcome to another episode of the Mankind Podcast. I'm the host today, Brandon Clift, and I'm joined again for this, the 4th time on our conversations on the archetypes with Doug Gillette. Mate, great to have you with us as we dive into the King archetype.
Great to be here.
So the King, the sovereign, the energy that I would dare say is so absent, well, let's just say in its fullness, is so absent in leadership today. That statement alone holds a lot of weight and I believe a lot of relevance as we navigate the very tricky terrain that is the world in 2022. But we have started the series. We went from the lover to the warrior. We last covered the magician. Now we're here at the king. I want to ask you, why was it important for you to have the king come in last?
I'm glad you asked that. It's because, I mean, if you think of the archetypes, forget the pyramid for right now, but if you, the pyramidal form, if you think of the archetypes as slates or rectangular panels, so to speak, or cards, I think the most obvious and the most, in a certain way, easily accessible archetypes for men are the lover and the warrior. So those are up front. Then behind them, and all animals display those characteristics of the lover and the warrior. Behind them, I see the magician set up just a little bit higher than the warrior and the lover, if you can picture that. Behind them, what the magician is, I mean, the thinking function in all, as we talked last week, in all kinds of ways. And animals, many animals, maybe all, maybe even plants to some extent, have some kind of regulatory, think about, strategizing and so forth. But what makes us humans really unique, I think, is the magician, the size, the power, and the complexity of that. So while I say that all animals at least have that, the magician in humans is what gives us really all of our abilities to reflect, to think, to strategize, to plan, to research, to speak, so it comes chronologically behind the lover and the warrior. And it also makes us us. The king then, the king is, in certain ways, the king is his own archetype, distinct from the others. But in another way, the king is the sort of culmination of the other three. At least the king in his fullness. And I do realize that a lot of men may, in their process, kind of charge through the lover and the warrior, pay lip service to the magician. What they really want to do is get on to the king. There's no way to get to the king in his fullness without going through the other archetypes. Because unless you have the magician's modulation of the lover and the warrior, you're not going to be humane or focused when you try to move into relationship with the king. Excuse me, spring allergies. And you will immediately fall into the shadow sides of the king if you don't have the other archetypes.
I like what you said before, Doug. Chronologically, we think about our development as a species, very primal in our behaviors. But yeah, the warrior energy, the doing, the crafting, or the fighting, and then we have the feeling, right? These are the lower hanging fruits, you could say. But then as we developed intellectually, that's where the kind of magician comes in. And eventually we got to the point of control and order, right? Creating groups, where I think that the king energy and the magician energy really come into play here. So it makes sense chronologically where the king lands. It also makes sense why it's so challenging to engage the king in its fullness, because you have to go through the other three, and have the awareness. Because I think of king as being the king energy in its fullness, of being very aware of the surroundings, aware of the kingdom and the environment.
And part of the way to say that, I think, is the ego is aware that it is not identical to any of the archetypes, including the king. As soon as the ego, the person we normally think of ourselves as being, identifies with any of the archetypes, but we're talking about the king, it immediately falls from the king in its fullness into the shadow.
Yeah.
Any identification, no one should be or try to be an archetype, because the archetypes are these extraordinarily powerful energies, forms, psychological structures, dynamics that the ego is enticed or lured into. Oh, that would be cool if I could be, but that's exactly where it falls into the shadow.
Right.
And I don't want to stress this, but I think it's really timely that we have on the world stage right now, in the Tsar Putin, a graphic, horrific, overwhelmingly destructive illustration of someone who's been possessed by the shadow warrior, by the who knows what magician functions are going on, but it doesn't look like there was much magician energy really put into the current project. And looks to me like the guy is completely overwhelmed by the shadow side of the king,
which I'd love to dive into as we kind of set the scene and delve more into the king. I think that's a great example, a relevant example, not that we have access to the man's psyche, but we can at least look at the actions and draw some insights from his behavior.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, and that's true for all of us. We don't have direct access to any psyche.
No,
not even our own, unless we're really into the self-reflective side of the magician.
We need to be Ram Dass level.
Right. But yeah, I and it's not just Putin, of course. It's and this is the problem with trying to institutionalize an archetype, as in the king. Historically, on the one hand, it's certainly true that civilization as we know it, as we've known it for the past 5,000, 6,000 years, would not have been, I won't say it wouldn't have been possible, but the only way that it did actually happen was through the leadership of kings, without exception. So here are these men accessing the archetype of the king. And if you want to be historical about it, I think you have to say two things. One, civilization and its achievements, which are technological, they're social, they're economic, they're political, all very important to rising levels of human prosperity and comfort and the possibility of freedom and self-realization and so forth. But at the same time, there is not an example of a historical king, a man accessing the king in those patriarchal societies who was up to the job.
Interesting.
There's not a single example.
Interesting. We see the yes, it's so interesting because I'm trying to rack my brain, not just historically, but in stories. We see the kings that we fall in love with in movies or in tales are the ones that didn't want it, or they didn't think that's where they were going to go. We can look at Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, Jon Snow in Game of Thrones, whereas you have the other side. You have those that are consumed with ideas of grandiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Like Macbeth, if we get Shakespearean,
Yeah.
disillusioned. He was disillusioned in his sense of self-importance and in his ruling. And then we look at our leaders today, many of them, you often wonder, at what cost did it take for them to end up in that position? At
Well,
what
right.
cost?
Right. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think without exception, the same men historically that were embodying the king, many of the great kings were possessed by the king. Okay, a lot of good flowed out of that. Ordering and the bringing of fertility and abundance, the two main functions of leadership in the archetype. At the same time, they did enormously destructive things, hurtful to others. And, I think that's probably baked in. I think we're stuck with what we are. So I'm not putting the men down who aspired to be kings and became kings in a societal and political way, but none of them were up to the task of being, of creating as fully as they could have humaneness, fairness, freedom, self-expression for their people.
Not up to the task. Well, I first want to kind of put a distinction in the king and its fullness. I've got some text here in my research that I found that I think sums it up pretty well. And please feel free to jump in if you disagree with anything here. When a man is living the king archetype in its fullness, he feels that same centering power within himself. Not that he believes the world revolves around him, but rather that his confidence, purpose, and well-being give him a supreme sense of balance. Even when the world around him becomes chaotic, he remains cool, calm, and collected. He acts rather than reacts. He's the rock in crisis. A man fully engaged with positive king energy is completely present as a man. Because of this position at the center of things, he can survey everything that is going on, soak it all in, and then take a broad view of things. This overarching perspective allows him to remain immovable in the face of the passing and superficial.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is an ideal.
Yes, slippery.
That is an ideal, and that covers what people in the institution who are called kings, that covers pretty much what the king archetype is that they're accessing. I think really the problem is, you said, what does it take to get to that position? What does it take, on the societal wide, historical, political scene? What does it take to get to that position? I'm afraid it often takes, I'm not saying always, but often takes quite a bit of ruthlessness, and grandiosity and determination to overcome not just one's own faults and weaknesses, but really to overcome others. And that's where the anti-patriarchists are right. So yeah, the idea, but I think, Brandon, what you're talking about is us, not institutional kings. You're talking about the king energy within us. When you quote those words, within each man, which never gets expressed fully, perfectly, ideally, as you describe it.
Well,
I guess one of the things I'm saying, I guess one of the things I'm saying is that, and you said it earlier in a different way, the archetype of the king is a dangerous archetype. They all are, but the king, because so much power is involved, is a dangerous archetype to try to interrelate with. And even in our personal lives, nobody gets to do it perfectly. And a lot of us screw up a lot trying to embody that. Contests for leadership, for example, in any organization are seldom without ego, let's say, or without narcissism as a major force. So yeah, the king is, because power is involved, and because everybody wants to be that, it's dangerous.
Yeah. To quote Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. But the word that shines out for me in that text that I read before is balance. You know, I remember there was this guy, Dominic Buckland. He'll probably never hear this. He was our school captain at school. We knew he was going to be school captain from second grade. This boy turned man was so balanced. He was so self-aware. I never got a sense of ego out of him. He never needed arrogance, or to use arrogance as a sword to pave his way. He just turned up in a way that made all of us go, oh, well, he's got something. He's got something that we don't. He's clearly going to be the school captain. And we sometimes jokingly called him Jesus.
Okay, and
right. Set him up. We could set him up for failure that way.
The rest of you, in a sense, were abdicating and projecting the king power onto him.
There you go.
It says a lot about him that he was able to hold that. But you know, just to be clear, that is abdicating and projecting.
Yes.
So we're already in the shadow.
You beat me to the point, Doug. But so for me, when I think about king and fullness, it doesn't relate to what's happening out there. It relates to what's happening inside of me, my kingdom. Am I keeping my environment clean? Am I aware of the influence that I have? Because I've heard it said that power really is the amount of influence one has over others. And so my power over others is directly reflective of the belief and how I behave and act within myself. Yet that's not the conversation we have when it comes to the king.
Well, but if I could do just a little more structure here. Institutionally, historically, the king's job was to order society. Ideally, be the center, on a throne on the primeval mound, the center of humankind, and to promulgate laws, ideally, of fairness, mutuality, and humaneness. I say ideally because those values, those ideals, you can find present in many ancient societies, medieval societies. It's the implementation of those ideals that has so poorly happened in human history. But ideally, the king institutionally is ordering, promulgating order around him, creating harmony in human society, creating harmony with the cosmos or the divine law. The king was basically everywhere, but certainly in Egypt, the pharaoh was the representative of humankind to the divine, and the recipient from the divine of the divine ordering. on heaven, in heaven as on earth, or on earth as in heaven. And so that you see in ancient Egyptian sculpture and paintings and so forth, the king, as representative of human beings, approaches the deity with an emblem of ma'at, or righteousness. He's offering the hoped for righteousness of humankind to the divine. The divine accepts it and continues to help, in this case, the Pharaoh, generate righteousness on earth. In personal terms, forget about the institution in that sense. This is men helping others to benevolently helping others to make benevolent order in their own lives. Integrating and helping them develop integrity, and that calm center thing, that's the king within us, helps us to be benevolently ordering within ourselves, to ourselves and to others. Our primary task in that respect is to integrate the aspects of our selves, conscious, semi-conscious, and unconscious. And out of that comes that sense of balance you're talking about, stability, so that the king power within us stabilizes emotional chaos within us, an excessive emotion within us, and promulgates that out, or radiates that out to others around him. That kind of centered benevolence results, to the extent that anything results, in idealized qualities, in fairness and humaneness within the personality of the man, accessing the king and then radiating out from him as from a central hill, mound, throne, whatever. The second and related main function of the king archetype is to provide and to stimulate fertility or blessing, abundance, institutionally for the people, for the land, etc. But in terms of the individual man's life, how does that work out? Well, it is if a man is acting from a healthy relationship with the king in his fullness, he is more he's not envious, so he doesn't have to put others down. He is mirroring and affirming of others to the extent that he possibly can be, helping others around him to abundance, financially, emotionally, experientially, cognitively. He imparts blessing, in other words, vitality and joy.
This comes back to something we often bring up in our conversations, is the integration piece. So for the king to be able to bestow the blessing onto others, he must be able to do it to himself first. But this isn't self-promotion of grandiose ideas. No, this, like, I can tell you how I get into my king: journaling, exercising, creating boundaries in my relationships, knowing, when to grant someone access to me and when not to. That's when I am able to, both feet planted on the ground, be able to bestow as well and give that onto others.
Excellent point. I was going to say that in giving to others, because we're human beings rather than archetypes, there are limits to what we can give, to the amount that we can give. And a man embodying or accessing the king in his fullness knows that he has boundaries, knows he has limitations of energy and abundance, that but it's because he knows himself, as I think you said earlier, and it is strong and confident and centered, that enables him to give more.
If you're enjoying the Mankind podcast, how about taking another step? Now, this one takes some courage, and you have it. Come check out the Men's Work Introduction. It's 3 sessions over 3 weeks. New sessions start every month where you can join other men on the path. Go to bit.ly/menswork1.
And you could do a thing where you say, the man that is calm, centered, firm, self-knowing, he is accessing the king as some kind of entity other than himself.
He becomes a conduit to the divine.
Right.
Yeah.
And he knows very well that he is not that.
Yeah.
And that allows for a calmness, because otherwise you get inflation if you identify with the king. If you don't realize that you're not it, you get infantile inflation, which brings on the tyrant, who is emotionally insecure, anxious, even paranoid, and covers those feelings with anger or rage. And again, not picking on one man in particular, but it's so obvious with what is happening with Putin that I mean, talk about paranoid and rageful. Rageful enough to play with the idea of destroying not just the Russia that he claims to love, which will be destroyed if he pushes the button, but humankind, the whole world. If I can't have my way, and there's the tyrant side of the shadow, then nobody's going to have anything.
And don't we have some recent examples historically on our shores?
Well, I mean, I don't.
that embody that same
energy.
energy. Yeah, if I don't get my way. You mentioned something before when you were discussing, so the 2 functions of fullness, right? Establishing order and harmony, and then you have the bestowing of fertility and blessings. When you were talking about order, you mentioned humanity. I was recently having a discussion with a good friend of mine, and we were talking about how, we talk about human. We are human, but we often forget the E at the end, which would make us humane. We often don't behave in a way that is humane. We don't talk to ourselves, let alone others, treat ourselves or others in a humane way. And his kind of working theory in his mind right now is that often comes from a sovereign wound. So power being taken away, or a feeling of powerlessness, an abdication of power.
Well, and that is the passive side of the king's shadow, is a sense of powerlessness, of worthlessness, of conscious, semi-conscious, or unconscious inability or unwillingness to take up the work that is necessary to be a king.
Not willing to do the work for
not
whatever
willing
reason.
to do the work. And so what comes out of that? Deeply, there's self-blame, but that is projected onto others. And so in the passive pole, the shadow king feels actually like a victim, the victim of others. And again, I mean, we're living in this epoch, and we have a fantastically horrific example of this on the historical stage,
Exactly.
where X number of would-be kings in Russia feel like they're the victim, or at least that's the way they're playing it.
Because their super
And
yachts are getting taken away.
yeah, well, even before that,
Sure.
it's like everybody, and there's the wound you're talking about. Everybody needs to be loved, affirmed, nurtured, their worthwhileness promoted, and so forth. If we don't get that, then we can fall into that victim thing. The victim is protected by rage. Anger is always a secondary emotion, covering fear, anxiety, sense of worthlessness, powerlessness. Anger is the way the organism mobilizes to defend itself. So then you flip over from the victim into the aggressor, the tyrant.
It sounds like, to me, it sounds like you're talking about the drama triangle, where you have the victim, you have the perpetrator, and you have the hero.
Right.
That tries to, the rescuer, probably a better word for that, where we can move between these different sides of the triangle. And the victim, like I've often heard anger and rage be referred to as the sword and the shield that's protecting a deep wound. And I want to dive deeper into the shadow, but I just want to kind of elucidate one point around the blessing, and I took this from the book. That the king in its fullness is delighted in noticing and promoting good men to positions of responsibility in his kingdom. He held audience primarily not to be seen, but to see, admire, and delight in his subjects, to reward them and to bestow honors upon them. And that, and why that's important. Young men today are starving for blessing from older men, starving for blessings from the king energy. This is why they cannot, as we say, get it together. They shouldn't have to. They need to be blessed. They need to be seen by the king, because if they are something, if they are, something inside will come together for them. That is the effect of blessing. It heals and makes whole. That's what happens when we are seen and valued and concretely rewarded for our legitimate talents and abilities. Rewarded for our legitimate talents and abilities. And one thing I see so very often, even in groups that I'm a part of, is that those with legitimate talents and abilities aren't rewarded. Why? Shadow king, what we call in MKP, king killers. Oh, we can't have those accessing their king energy in its fullness come up, because that will then threaten our status.
That in the presence of a person like that, who has, for whatever reasons, temperament, nurturing, having done the work, like the guy you were talking about earlier who became the school captain. In the presence of someone like that, we humans tend to have at least two responses. One is to kill them, take them down. The other is to adulate them. But then there's a third thing, but you have to be pretty mature to do this. There's a third thing that is a recognition of the maturity, emotional and cognitive maturity of that person, without envy and without over admiration. And if all works right, that person who is more emotionally mature is stimulating the emergence of greater maturity in the men around him.
Mm.
See,
Yeah.
the tyrant will crush aspirations of that nature in the men around him. The weakling the weakling or abdicating king will feel like a victim, and also when the opportunity arises, try to crush rising maturity in the men around him.
Let's set the model for the listeners right now as we dive into the shadow. So previously in episodes, we've spoken about the pyramid, the triangle at the top. You can imagine at the top of the point, you have the king in its fullness. Imagine a horizontal line going through the triangle. And on the bottom, you have 2 points, which represent the shadow. You have the active in the left point, and then you have the passive on the right. The tyrant in this case is on the left in the active pole, and you have the weakling on the right in the passive pole. First things first, I want to ask you, Doug, what commonly causes us to fall into shadow as it relates to our king archetype?
Mm-hmm. As we've talked in previously, I think our primary wound is in the lover. Because if we got loved enough, we got mirrored, we got nurtured, we got affirmed. Of course, being in this world, which is a dangerous place to be, and human beings, which are dangerous, being flawed as we are, there is no way to escape primal wounding in the lover.
Yeah.
There's no baby that was ever born, no infant, no toddler, no little kid that has not been wounded
at some point.
And even if they have the best of parents in terms of emotional and cognitive maturity, they're gonna be wounded. It's just being here in this dimension of reality. But of course, there are degrees of woundedness, and that is partially a reflection of the temperament we're born with. It's partly a reflection of the parenting or early caregiving we got. So, but the point is that the lover is the most important thing for infants. The love because they're helpless and they're looking to the parent, literally looking in the parent's eyes for how to feel about themselves and the world. So that's the first blessing or not that they get. But whatever, then they move into the warrior. But if the lover is to the extent the lover's wounded, the warrior is going to tend to be sadistic. Because again, anger, rage, sadism, etc., are all covering wounds.
Right.
So
then the magician manipulates.
And that is wounding to others. So do unto others before they do unto you, or do unto others as they have done unto you, or do unto others as you fear they might do unto you.
It's the misconception of I'm going to hurt you before you hurt me. No, that's such a lie. I am going to hurt myself by hurting you.
Yeah, there is that too, and that gets really complicated. Masochism, sadism, etc. But that's how men come to the king energy wounded.
Right.
It's a setup for either manifesting the king as a tyrant or as an abdicating weakling. So I mean, becoming an emotionally mature human being, emotionally and cognitively humane human being, is work for most people. I mean, unless you just happen to be blessed with a certain temperament that you're just
it's a mountain. It's a mountain of work that is endless for sure. And it makes you wonder, God, what if Hitler made it into art school?
Right.
Like the wounds that occurred in that man's life that caused him to become the tyrant that he was.
Right.
And who knows what those wounds are for, say,
Mhm.
Putin. The tyrant, the tyrant, I imagine when I think of the tyrant within me, and I would very confidently say it's not one that I access. I'm more going to the weakling side of
Uh,
things if I'm in the
uh,
shadow of
uh,
my king. But the tyrant, I think of force, my
mhm,
way or the highway, hack and
mhm.
slash, burnt, scorched earth. Just it is to defend whatever grandiosity or
Yeah,
ideas or
yeah, it is.
status.
Yeah.
A lot, and then the weakling, the passive shadow, whereas instead of taking control of one's life, it's just letting it go, and
Giving
and,
it
and
to others.
giving it to others, but on the same token desiring it.
Yeah,
So
giving it to others and resenting the
mm,
fact that you've done that and resenting them that they accepted it.
oh, and then what happens then is the undermining and the rusting of the foundations. We see this in team members professionally. I've witnessed someone not get a promotion that many would argue they deserved, and then we watched how that person went from an ally to the team
Mhm.
to a
Mhm.
complete
An
uh,
enemy.
a complete enemy to the
Yeah.
mission of the team, because they weren't granted the status, the title, the pay that they believed they were deserved,
Yeah.
and it became incredibly destructive.
I'm gonna you're reading quotes from King Warrior Magician Lover. I'm gonna read a quote too,
Sure.
if that's okay. The tyrant king manifests in all of us at some time or another. That's
Mm.
important to realize because um, we, well, when we feel pushed to the limit, when we are exhausted, when we are getting inflated, unquote, end quote, and challenged in that inflation.
Mm.
It's not a question of, none of us are going to become the ideals. And that's okay. That's okay. I mean, we are what we are. Our human
Mhm.
nature is what it is. It's about modulating. It's about controlling in that sense, or containing. It's about it's not about perfection. It's about doing the best that you possibly can do given your temperament and
Mm.
circumstances.
Mm. Giving yourself that grace,
Yeah, that
and
is.
then how we almost make it impossible to lead in society today, because we just love, all of us weaklings, we love to tear down the leaders
Mhm.
that we have in front of us. They don't get a margin of error
Right.
before we just slander their names when they make mistakes.
That's true.
And nor do we have a culture where it's seen as safe for a leader to go, I made a mistake, and
Right.
I take ownership for that mistake. A
Yeah.
recent example, and you may or may not be aware of the situation with Joe Rogan and Spotify. And so he's got a very popular podcast. It's arguably the most famous podcast of all time. And he has had a series of guests, and throughout his 1,000+ episodes, he's had very uh, risky guests join the show with very risky opinions, let's just say. And
Mhm.
he himself has shared some of these opinions, which has gotten him in a lot of hot water. And when this came out, and when every news outlet wanted to grab onto the story of him being racist, sexist, or all of these
I
titles,
have heard a little about that. Yeah.
yeah, he came out, he turned on his phone, he didn't do a press release, he turned on his phone and said, these things have been brought to my attention, and I am going to do a lot of work around this to bring
Mhm.
on more varied interests, opinions, and guests. And I apologize of
Mhm.
the impact of what I've done, or the actions of the reactions that have been caused by my show. I'm only going to do my best to get work better. And I observed that the news couldn't grab onto anything after that,
Ah.
because he came out and he took ownership, which when it comes to the king archetype, if we talk about going from shadow to back to fullness,
Mm-hmm.
of my feelings are that ownership is the way.
Yeah, ownership is a good word. Yeah, so how do we, recognizing that we all carry a lot of shadow,
Mm.
and it's easier to be a human being in the grip of the shadow sides of the archetypes than it is, sorry about the phone.
That's okay.
You want to pause while that, I can't shut it off.
Yeah, quick pause.
Okay, I'm ready.
Cool.
Yeah. Where were we?
So we're talking about ownership.
Yeah, ownership. Ownership is what is essential in ownership of your one's own issues, and in this case, shadow stuff is decoupling or disidentifying from any archetype whatsoever. It's when the ego identifies itself, in this case, archetype of the king, even in his fullness, it doesn't come out right. It throws us into the shadow forms. And actually the shadow forms go together. They're two sides of the same coin, as we've been talking. The ego has to be clear. The I, who I normally think of myself as being, has to be clear that it is not the king. Because the human being as a whole, led by the ego, that thinks that it is the king, cannot at that moment and escape falling into the shadow. The ego has to be the servant of the king. That's that servant leadership part. But then that brings up another issue, and that is the servant of what? The servant of what? Well, in this case, the servant of the king, the divine king. Okay, that brings up yet another set of issues. What is the divine king that you are the servant of like? What are his characteristics? Because it's really important what we become the servants of.
And that's where I feel like we can't turn to a book or an example historically. I think that's where we have to tap into a higher knowing of what does it mean, the divine king for which I want to serve.
Mm-hmm.
What do I? What do I? Who am I in my divinity? Who am I?
Well, right,
That higher
right.
place. And again, hence why it's so tricky to access the king in its fullness, because I mean, you say I, and the ego goes, yes.
yeah.
Hello.
Well, there's little I,
Big I,
and big I. But what I'm suggesting is that it's really important once you have reached the place where you're able to experience yourself as a servant of the king. It's really important to be clear about what the characteristics of that king that you are the servant of are. Because there are a lot of, let's say, God images out there.
Sure.
Causes, whatnot, that people do serve. So service alone or servant leadership alone doesn't get it. I mean, that's a step toward health and maturity, but then there's the question of, is what you're serving worthy
Yeah.
of a human being, and of human values, and that's, I would bring that back to the idea of the king in his fullness is the image of what we should be serving.
Hmm.
You know,
Well, the king in his fullness seeks to integrate all the other archetypes and all good principles in order to reach his full potential, so that he may use this energy for a higher purpose and to bless the
higher
lives of
purpose,
others.
right?
And to bless the lives of others.
And
You know,
blood,
I live in the Bible Belt. Servant leadership is thrown around left and right here in professional circles and spaces, but seldom do you meet someone who truly embodies that.
mm-hmm,
That I am not here for my promotion,
mm-hmm.
for my image. I am here for you.
I am here to help you
Mm-hmm.
or bring benevolent order within yourself, around you. I am here to bring you or make it possible or enable or empower you to experience abundance,
Mm-hmm. That's
and self.
Yeah. And if we're talking Joseph Campbell, I think that's where the guide sits really well in the hero's
Mhm,
journey. The
mhm,
guide
mhm.
is at a
Right.
place where they've traversed the hero's journey so many times that they then sit in a place to be able to go, hey, let me grant you access, or make aware within yourself of what you are capable of.
Right.
But it all comes back to doing the work.
Doing the work to become humane.
To become humane. Do the work to become humane.
Mm-hmm. Which doesn't
Slap that
mean
on a
weak. It doesn't mean weak. It doesn't mean Pollyanna. It
no.
means humane out of strength, from strength.
I'm just typing that down because I think that should be on a t-shirt.
Bumper stickers.
Bumper stickers right there. I love it. I love it. Well, Doug, you know, there's I mean, each of these archetypes that we've covered, we could spend weeks on each of them.
Yeah.
But I love the model that you and Robert came together with. It's clearly, from all the research I've been doing with these interviews and these episodes, and not let alone the impact it's had on my life, the knock-on effect of the work you two have done together is phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. There are ripples and then there are waves, and I believe the two of you created waves with this. So just honor and blessings to you for being able to share this with us.
Very glad to hear that. And I receive your blessing and honor.
Yeah.
And return
that's
it.
king.
And return it.
Yeah. Two kings in an interview. I love it. So as we kind of round out, this isn't the last we're going to see of you. We have I'm bringing in Boyson and Paul, my fellow co-hosts, into the conversation for the four of us to discuss Axis Mundi, which is something that we have mentioned throughout these episodes. But what we're really talking about is being in connection with all of the energies, but not consumed by any of them. If you can imagine a four-pointed star, you've got I, me, or you standing in the center, and we can go to any of those energies, let a foot out into the warrior, into the king, but there's always one foot still remaining in the center.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to have this conversation, because we're going to talk about integration, because with these 4 interviews we've done thus far, you may, as a listener, be in your head just trying to grasp the concepts of these. Perhaps got your piece of paper out like I did when I first learned these, and moving all the titles. Tyrant lives here, impotent lover lives here, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But then integration is a whole other story. I mean, that in my mind is the work, and that's where it gets incredibly fun. Fun and messy. They're allowed to live together. So I'm excited for that conversation, Doug. Before we tie a bow on the king, are there any final comments that you want to share about the king energy?
Well, I mean, just a kind of summary, the king in his fullness really does draw, and we'll talk about this in that later thing, really does draw on the uh, the lover in his fullness, the warrior in his fullness, the magician in his fullness.
Mm.
And so I would say that it's all part of the work. And it's kind of like wherever you start the work, whatever thing you need to heal in whatever quarter, it will all come toward the center. It will all be worked toward the center and centering, which is humane. And so I would say, the king in that sense is, because he stands behind the magician, who stands behind the lover and the warrior. It takes a lot of doing to get to the level of emotional and cognitive maturity that the king archetype in his fullness represents. But man, is it worthwhile to the extent that we can do that. Never perfectly, but wow.
Yes, I don't think there are words to truly represent what you just said, because, and this is me now speaking to those of you who may be new to, say, men's work, or perhaps going on a therapy journey right now, the self-awareness that comes from the experience, the doing of this work, whether it's sitting in circle with men and getting processed, channeling anger, or whatever the process may be, that work, it's the scaffolding. It's the scaffolding of Eddie Murphy, believe it or not, I think said it perfectly. All men are sculptors, constantly chipping away at the unwanted parts of their lives to find their idea of the perfect masterpiece. And this process is just a little chip. It's just a little chip away every time at the marble that is the masterpiece is inside all of you. It's inside me. It's inside Doug. The only way we can get to that is not in our heads and writing down what we think is the best thing and thinking it into existence. No, we have to think, we have to do, we have to feel, we have to see, we have to use the vision of the king as well. We need it all. And there's no linear path. I can tell you that right now for those of you that are looking to hack the process. There's no hack. There's no hack. It's doing the work.
Right.
I'm going to breathe that in. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Brandon. It's been a trip. It really has. And I'm looking forward to our next foray. And that'll be to the, as you say, the axis mundi, the center. There's all kinds of fantastic and wonderful and exciting things to envision, imagine, and integrate about that center.
There we go. Yeah, this will be the best one yet, I can tell. Thank you, Doug. And I want to thank all of you listening at home. This has been another episode of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we are breaking the molds of modern manhood to prove there is more than one way to be a man. And today we proved there are more than one way to be a king. Lots of love. We will see you next week for our conversation, getting the whole band together to talk about Axis Mundi. See you then. Well, there you have it, another powerful interview for the Mankind Podcast with Doug Gillette. I hope you got some insights from that episode. I myself, having listened to it back through the editing process, have just taken even more notes, things that went right past me during the interview that I didn't even realize he was saying. I'm like, oh, there's a gem. And so I hope you yourself have gained a lot of gems out of this. This series is not over, because next week we're inviting Doug back on to talk about Axis Mundi, which is the center. We don't want to get consumed or possessed by all of these energies or any of these energies at one time. We want to be able to stay in the center. I mean, if you can imagine a compass, Keep one foot in the center, and if you want to go to the king, you step forward into the north, keeping one foot in the center, and then you access that king energy, but never leaving that foot, never letting that foot leave the center. So, with that in mind, here are some reminders for you to access the king archetype. Know that you have to go through the others to get there. You have to get clean with your warrior, your lover, your magician, which is easier said than done. And guess what? It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't mean the king isn't accessible unless you're clean in all those areas. No. However, if you can create a practice, a ritual, some form of meditation perhaps that can help you acknowledge these energies, that's when I find the king comes into play. So if I can give you anything, I want to give you my practice to access my king energy. And of course, do with this what you will. This is just what I found has worked for me. And it's a meditation. So generally in the mornings, when I'm following a routine and when I'm actually a bit more disciplined with my days, it's not every day, but I'll take my shoes off. I will go stand outside in the dirt, in the grass. The idea is to get grounded. No distractions, no music. I am in the backyard, feet in the grass or the dirt, and I face the east. As I'm facing the east, I'm calling in the energy of the lover. And as I'm calling in the energy of the lover, I'm thinking about all of the characteristics of the lover in its fullness. I also think about how the lover falls into shadow through an emotional wound. And I ask myself, I do a checkup. Am I sitting in any of the poles of the shadow lover? It's kind of like a health check, you could say. An energetic archetypal health check. There you go. There's a big phrase for you. Then, once I feel clean there, I will move to the warrior. So I look in the south, stand facing the south. I will call in the energy of the warrior, do the same thing. Warrior in its fullness. How do I fall into shadow? Am I sitting in any of those poles? Again, it's a checkup. Then I move to the magician, and then I move to the king. Once I've done that, there's an option here to be able to call the energy from above, Father Sky, energy below, Mother Earth. And that, for me, is how I can basically check in with myself is which energies are alive in me right now? Where is my energy going? Even if I am in various shadow poles of each of these archetypes, I still get to access king energy because I am taking stock of the kingdom. I'm looking at as what is going on for me in my life in that very moment as it pertains to my psyche. So that's an exercise that works for me. Perhaps there are some others that work for you, but I just thought I would share that with you because those that I have introduced this practice to, it's been pretty cool to see that many of them are still keeping it up. So take that, use it if you will. Otherwise, I hope you have enjoyed this episode of the Mankind Podcast. I want to remind you as well, if you are looking to seek deeper meaning, connection, and really just kind of build these emotional tools and this emotional awareness and responsibility as you go through your men's work journey, it is almost always easier done with a group, done with other men. So I encourage you, if you don't currently have a community of men that you connect with, you can head to the show notes. You can find a men's group near you through mkpusa.org. Or if there isn't any any geographical groups near you, there are virtual options as well, all over each and every time zone that I'm sure we can find to support you and get you access to. So that's enough for me. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. And yeah, let's talk about Axis Mundi. We'll see you next week. Lots of love. This has been another episode of the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. We have been your hosts, Paul Newell, Boyson Hodgson, and myself, Brandon Clift, and we want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. If you want to find out more about today's guests and support them in their mission, you can find links to them in the show notes. Now, if you have found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, we are always grateful for a rating and review of the show on iTunes. Now, we've got to give special thanks to our back-end team, producer, editor, and audio ninja for the show, Michael J. Russer, and Don Huff, who takes care of our graphics and promotions and pretty much makes us look pretty. So, of course, thank you, Don. Now, above all else, we've got to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you have made it possible for us to let men all over the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. And if something in this episode has touched you, then perhaps it is the call to action to get involved in men's work. With live trainings happening constantly and in-person trainings happening all over the world, the Mankind Project definitely has something for you. Now, if you've enjoyed the music in this episode and all of our episodes, be sure to check out Jim Donovan and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. And lastly, just know, what it means to me to be a man is completely different than what it means for you. What it means for Paul, what it means for Boyson, that is the beauty of this journey. So if you are looking for guidance, support, and community as you begin to unpack and dive deeper into your men's work journey, then you know where to find us. Same place, same time, next week. Lots of love. We'll see you then.